Okay, so today's Wednesday lunchtime live is all about our little simple beginners project, which is a tote bag with a contrast pocket. So as I said, it doesn't have to be a contrast, it's literally a simple tote bag with a front pocket. I'm just going to show you the bits that we need and talk to you about the dimensions. So you can make this bag whatever size you like. This is just some basic dimensions that I've used and found work quite well, and I'm working in half scale just for the demo because it makes it easier with my cameras. So the first thing we need, we've got to cut two rectangles 14 inches across, 16 inches down. So that's two rectangles of the fabric that you want to see on the outside, 14 by 16. Then you cut a single rectangle that is 12 by 14. So it's the same width and it's around about 2/3 of the pockets of the bag size in total. And then you're going to need two pieces of webbing or ribbon for your straps, and these are a taste thing, so around about I can give you the measurements for that later, but measure a bag that you like the fit of and actually pop that in. So I will give you the dimensions for these. I forgot to measure my sample. So it depends whether you want to create a bag with a long strap to hook over your shoulder, or whether you want to create a bag that's more like a sort of shopper bag. So these are all things that you can make adjustments to when you make your own projects. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to work on is making up my pocket. So I'm going to set the two bag pieces to one side and we come back over, and I'm just using a ham. There's no reason to use a ham because I've got a quilting mat down. I don't want to melt it. So take this smaller rectangle, the single one, your contrast pocket, and fold that in half. And then press this and give yourself a nice crease. This is going to form the upper part of our pocket. So we fold that in half, like so. Let's give that a good press. So it would really work a lot better with a bit of steam. As always, I don't use steam near my cameras. Okay, and then we're going to fold this again. So we're folding it along its length or across the width to get a little crease here. And this little crease is going to give you a nice little sewing line. Okay, so can you see I've got that nice little crease, and that's where I'm going to sew the pocket in place. So the next step, I'm going to take one of my bag pieces, and I do suggest, unlike me guys, that you press this piece of fabric before you get going. So even before you cut it out, it's a good idea to press. I was just in a little bit of a kind of distraction with my deliveries. So then we're going to take our pocket piece, and with that sort of crease facing up, we are going to line that up along the bottom edge and the two sides. So this is the little pocket. So again, the dimensions of this pocket, you could change that if you want a higher pocket. So it's just a sort of whatever you fancy, guys. Okay, and then I'm going to pop a few pins along this crease, ready to take to the sewing machine and sew that in place. Now I suggest that you sew from the hem to the top of the pocket, because that way you can control your back stitching. If you start at the top, it's very hard to control that. So I'm going to use this little stack of post-its to help me with my seam allowance, but for the first thing, all I'm doing is using the centre of my foot, which is aligned with my needle, to run along this row of this little crease line that I put in. You could mark this. A little bit of back stitching, but only within the seam allowance at the bottom. So literally just, these are very fine pins, guys, don't worry that I'm sewing over them. For demo, it's just easier for me not to have to block what I'm seeing with my pin taking out hand. So nice and slowly when we get to the top, and then maybe even walk that last stitch. So we want to just hit the outside edge of that fold, then reverse away, and then maybe just do one step forward. And even though I've got a thread cutter, I'm going to leave a long tail so I can pull this through to the reverse. So what I've done now is I've attached that pocket bag to the front of my tote bag, and then we're just going to secure this with a few pins to start constructing the hem along the top of the tote bag. So you can see here that I've stitched along the center, and I used a reasonably contrasting-ish. I'm just going to pull this thread through, and that's just grabbing it from the reverse side. If it's all caught up a bit like this, then don't worry. And then I'm just going to snip that really close and just snip that off. Okay, so I'm going to place a few pins just to anchor this pocket while we're constructing the bag, because now I'm going to use this front as one piece altogether. Okay, so they're going to stay there just while we start constructing our bag. So the next step is to make the hem that goes along the top of the bag, and that's also where we're going to insert our little straps. So I'm going to grab my iron, and you guys are going to measure this carefully. I'm just going to eyeball it for the demo. The first fold, we're going to do a double folded hem. And a double folded hem means it's got two folds. So our first fold is 1 centimetre. I'm just going to do this in half scale. So I'm just doing a little skinny fold. And the reason we use a double fold is because it means it's nice and neat on the inside, and we've got no raw edges poking out. Okay, and then the second one is 1 inch or 2.5. So again, I'm going to use half scale, and you would normally either with a seam measuring gauge or your tape measure, just keep coming along and making sure that that's the right measurement. So that is 2.5 up here. So this is the hem at the top of the bag, and it's also where we're going to place our straps. So our straps on the pattern will give you a little position. So if you're just freestyling this, you want to sort of make sure that it's kind of looks quite pleasing. And make sure your strap's not twisted. So that looks like a nice little ratio for me. Remember, I've got seam allowance here, so I don't want it too close to the outside and I don't want it too close to the middle. And then just double check that these are the same distance. So that's 1 3/4. And again, this is just because I'm in and that's 2. So I need to adjust one of these to make sure that they're the same distance from the sides. Okay, and you're literally just pushing that right up to your first crease. And then it's a good idea to place a pin on the actual ribbon or your strap to stop these moving as we sew, because you guys are probably going to be taking your pins out and you want to make sure that this stays in place. And then when we go to the sewing machine, we always want to have the bulk of our fabric to the left. So if I rotate the piece like this and then rotate it again, so the bulk of my work is facing my body, and I'm going to pin from right to left, like so. Now this is if you're right-handed. If you're left-handed, have the bulk of the fabric or the project away from you and pin from left to right. Obviously I can't pin very well with my left hand because I'm a righty, but that way the pins are always in the right direction to go to the sewing machine. So we're going to hop back to the machine and sew this first row pretty close to this folded edge here. So for this, what's important is we do want to be pretty close to this inner edge, but it's more important, because we're going to seal this from the outside, that we keep our stitching parallel with this edge here. So this is where your post-it comes in. So when you get your needle in a good spot, like so. You can take a stack of post-its, so they've got a little ridge, and take the paper off the back. So that was, yeah. And then align this like this, and that will give you a nice guideline. So again, a couple of stitches forward. Don't want to see my back stitching too much in my bag. And then slow and steady, and I'm focusing on keeping it parallel to the upper edge. And keep your straps nice and anchored at 90 degrees. See how mine had moved a little there? So just focusing on that edge there. Okay, so that's our strap held into place. And now I'm going to, and I usually do this at the iron, but just for speed, I'm just going to do a little bit of finger pressing. I'm going to flip the strap upwards, and we're going to sew a second row along the top. So make sure you get this nice and anchored so it doesn't move when we come to sew. And this secures the strap, keeps it nice and flat, and makes this junction a little neater. Okay, so I've flipped that up, pinned those in place, and this time I'm going to focus on the 1/8 guide on the front of my bobbin cover. And when you come over the straps, you won't have a guide, so you just have to sort of go for it really. So this edge is just lined up with my post-it, which is on the 1/8 guide. I'm not going to worry about back stitching because it's going to go into the seam allowance anyway. So slow and steady. So the important thing when you sew over the strap is it doesn't scooch out of the way like so. Again, don't worry about back stitching at the end because we're going to come in and seam that. All right, guys. So what you can see is that we've got 2 parallel rows of stitching, and one is holding this hem down but also catching the tape in place, or your straps in place. The second one is securing that and is parallel to the edge, but we're only going to see this stitching from the outside, which is why we wanted to make sure that everything was parallel with this upper folded edge. So now that we've done this to the first side, so this is the front, I'm going to prep the back in exactly the same way. We're going to just come back to the iron and look at the second half of our tote bag. So this is the back of the tote bag, and you could have one fabric on the front, one fabric on the back, and then a contrast for the pocket. So it's a great way to use up your scraps. So you guys are going to press 1 centimetre, and when I teach this with beginners, I suggest you have a tape measure or a measuring gauge, and you just keep checking that as you go along. You can also buy a cardboard template that you can use, so whatever works for you to get this pressed into place. I always press my hems before I stitch them. My second row was about 1.25, but for full size it's 2.5 centimetres. So I'm just going to press that. And again, just keep using your tape measure to keep this even. Not my breast pressing, guys. And then we are going to grab our front and line it up with our back, so that we make sure we get this in exactly the right spot. So the reason I do it this way rather than purely by measurements is to make sure if this slipped as I sewed, I just want to align this when we come to do the second row. So I'm using that as my guideline there. You can kind of get those absolutely lined up. You could also have done it this way around. So you've just got this as your little kind of guideline, or if you're using a pattern, then you can use the notches that are on your pattern as your guideline. But this is just in case everything's moved when you stitch the first side, which if you're a beginner, that's going to happen, and that's absolutely okay. And then we're going to come in, again making sure that the strap is not twisted. Pop that in place like so. Alright, and when you're happy that everything looks even Stevens, because when our bag joins together we don't want the straps to misalign, we are then just going to pop a few pins, hold this in place, go back to the machine and stitch this in exactly the same way as I stitched the first one. Back to the machine, and again my first guideline was just under the 1.5 I believe, so my gauge to get this set is I line up my needle where I want this to be sewn. Just take that one out of the way for a second. Then it's just inside that 1.5, and again because I'm going to be taking a seam allowance, I'm not too worried about there being back stitch on this one, and I'm focusing on this folded edge lining up with my post-it. So I didn't do a very accurate pressing job for speed, but you guys are going to do a much more accurate pressing job than me. So that's the first row of stitching, and then we're going to come back and look at this on the iron. So I'm going to do this one properly. So what I usually do with this, once I've pressed in that first row of stitching, or stitched in that first row, give that little press just to stretch everything out, and then making sure they stay at 90 degrees, just flip this up, making sure that you don't pull that folded edge, so there's a little bit of a fold below that stitch line. Press that in place at 90 degrees to the edge. Again, that's at 90 degrees. And then again, it's a good idea just to put some pins that are going to hold this in place right up to where you start sewing. Okay, so we're ready to go back to the sewing machine now, and we're going to sew this upper folded edge. So this is where I use my single post-it. I'm aligning it with the 1/8 guide on my bobbin cover. And then if you don't have that 1/8 guide, what you can do is you line up the needle in the place that you want to sew, which is about 1/4 inch from this edge, and then come in and line up your post-it with that folded edge. So slow and steady. I'm not going to worry about my back stitching again. And can you see I'm holding on to this strap just to make sure that it doesn't go for a walk when I sew over it. And then I can take that pin out once I know that that's anchored. And again, I'm holding on to this just to make sure that as I bring the needle on, the strap doesn't move. Like so. Then I can pop that pin out. And whiz down the bottom. And again, I'm not going to worry about the back stitch. So now we've got the back of our bag made, the front of our bag with the pocket made, and the next step is to join the two together all the way around the sides. So this is, in sewing, this is often called bagging out, where you sew something with the right sides together and then you turn it from inside out to right side out. So to do this, I'm going to lay down, got my front piece laid flat, and then I'm going to lay my back on top. And what's really important, we can always adjust the sides if we need to, but we want to make sure that our straps line up and that these two upper folded edges line up, so that we don't end up with a bag that's got a sort of step like so. So it's right at the very beginning, I focus on the top. And where this is kind of sticking out, I can give that a little trim right at this stage. I probably just didn't cut out my pocket pieces very accurately. So not to worry if you've got any discrepancies. So I'm going to pin very carefully right at this top edge, making sure that my folds are exactly on top of each other, and hopefully your straps are still aligned. And then I'm also going to do the same over here. And then I like to pin, because the sewing machine sort of stretches the fabric a little bit. So I like to pin with my pins horizontal or parallel to the horizontal to the edge. And I'm just lightly stretching a bit, which is going to replicate what the sewing foot will do. See, I'm just smushing that down. And then I'm going to pin a little bit at that corner. And then I'm also going to pin this side from the top down to the bottom, because we can always adjust things down at the bottom. So pinning this way means you won't end up with funny little pleats or tucks forming, and then pin that at an angle. And then I can always check. See, I've got a little bit of wonkiness here, so at this stage I can just trim that away. So even if you've made a mistake in your cutting out, you can always fix things later. And now I'm going to pin this bottom edge. So by not pinning it in one continuous go, hopefully when we get to the machine, I won't have any kind of folds of fabric developing at the bottom. Okay, so that's ready to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew from the top all the way down, across, and then up again. So again, I'm going to use my 1.5 guide on the machine, and I'm going to mark that with my little stack of post-its. So if you've got a computerized machine, this is a safer way of marking a seam allowance than using a magnetic guide. And until you get your eye in, it's just a nice little way of being able to see the distance from the edge. So I've just put a parallel pin, because this horizontal pin is going to get caught on my post-it right at the very beginning. Now when I start on an open edge like this, I'm going to start maybe 1 centimetre in, like so, drop my needle, and I'm going to go backwards first. So this way I shouldn't squash up the upper edge, and then come forwards. So this is a bag, this is a stress point on your bag, so you might want to do that again. So repeat the backwards and then come forwards. So that just gives you a little bit more stability at the stress point on your bag. So we're going to whiz down here through all the layers. Now on this machine, I believe that my 1.5 turning point is this mark here. So what you can do is set your post-it, maybe it's that circle, I haven't measured it on this machine. You can set your post-it so that the lower edge is going to line up with the lower edge, and that will indicate where to turn. That will make more sense in a second, guys. And I'm heading down here nice and slow, and when this bottom edge is aligned with the bottom edge of my post-it, if I put that on my horizontal seam guide, I can just check that. There we go. Can you see that that's, I could maybe do like half a stitch more. So it's kind of aligned with the bottom of the post-it. And then I drop my needle to turn the corner, lift up my foot to spin my fabric, and I can turn. So you've got a parallel seam guide, but you've also got horizontal seam guides on your machine. And if you haven't got that, if you've got an older machine, you can just mark them up by measuring the distance from your needle. So again, as I come along here, I'm going to go nice and slowly until this edge aligns with the bottom edge of my post-it. These post-its aren't very sticky today. Go slow and steady to get to that corner. Drop your needle to turn a corner, lift up your foot, spin your fabric, and then we're going to carry on. So the other reason that this is a great beginner project, and the reason why I used 2 separate pieces for the front and the back of the bag, is it's a great way to teach people how to sew corners. So totes and cushions are a good way to teach people how to control their sewing machine. So slow and steady when we come up to the top, because we want to make sure nothing slips. And again, don't go right off the edge. Just going to stop like half a stitch, do some back stitching, come forward, do some more back stitching, just to really make sure that this is nice and strong at the top. And then raise up your foot and bring your work out of the machine. And the next little step, I'm just going to tidy up my seam allowances by giving this a little trim, and then we're going to neaten our raw edges so that our bag doesn't fall apart as we use it, and then it's done. Okay, so I'm just going to trim off about 1/2 centimetre just to make sure that all the edges are aligned when I go to the machine. And the trick for this is that I've got the bulk on the right hand side of me, and with my left hand I'm just holding on to the little bit that I'm trimming away. So this gives me a bit of an anchor, and I'm going to show you the difference on the other side. If I was to come in here and try and trim away, it's harder to sort of control everything, and I'm much more likely to get a wobbly line. So I always have the bulk to the right hand side, and then I'm using my left hand to hold on to the bit that I'm trimming away. And then the last side to be trimmed is the bottom. Okay, so now we know that we've got all our edges are nice and lined up. At this point I might think about just carefully coming in those pins that were holding the pocket bag in place, just to give it, I could see them glinting, so it's a good reminder to take them out now so that when we turn the bag out we haven't got them scratching our hands. All right, so I'm going to go around these 3 sides and zigzag over the edge. So this is a method called neatening the seams, and it's going to stop our fabric from fraying and falling apart. So when we come to the sewing machine, I'm going to remove that post-it. I'm going to use this 1/8 guide again because it's a good guide for the zigzag. And then I'm going to set my machine to a zigzag stitch. So on my machine that's number 8, and I'm using a 5 on the width and 2 on the length, and that's a good sort of general guide for zigzagging. So these are things you'll need to look at your manual just to check. So again, this is one of the few times I might do a reverse with a zigzag. I'm going to start about 1 centimetre down, drop my needle in, and then I'm just going to do a few back stitches to the top, because this edge is kind of open, so it's just to make sure that we're filling in all the fabric. So now I'm just focusing on keeping my cut edge, my trimmed edge lined up with my post-it. So it's zigging in the fabric and zagging over the edge. And this is just a really great way to simply neaten the edges. Now when we come to the bottom, we don't really have a trick like we did before. We just have to kind of keep an eye out. So I'm going to go slow and steady to the bottom. And I'm going to go almost down. So my needle is just outside the fabric and I'm on the bottom of the edge. And then I lift that up, but it's not in the fabric, so I'm sort of swinging the fabric around my needle because I want to make sure that I get all over this corner. Again, I'm just focusing here. It's zigging in and sagging over the edge. So zigs in the fabric, sags over the edge, and again, slow and steady at the corner. And I'm just going to drop my needles just on the outside edge of my fabric. Lift up your foot and keeping the fabric close to the needle, spin around and then carry forwards. And again, when we get to the top, I often don't do a reverse on a zigzag. But on this project, this is exposed, so I am going to do a little bit of reverse stitching. So come almost off the edge and then do a little bit of back stitching just to secure that and then release. Cool. Okay guys, so this is what it looks like. We've zigzagged over the edge. And don't worry if you've got any bits that aren't perfect, that's fine. You can either just come in and trim, or it will fray until it hits the stitching. So I'm just going to snip off any whiskers and grab my pressing surface, because I'm just going to press into all the stitching that I've put in, and this kind of stretches everything out and sets it in place. So this is good practice for all your sewing. If you stitch something, just press it flat. So it's kind of like, it's called under pressing. It just kind of stretches out your seam line and it will make it look nicer from the outside. And now I'm ready to turn this little bag to the right side. But first of all, for my corners, I'm going to use a little corner trick where I'm going to take, so I'm right-handed, I'm going to take my left thumb and slide that and push it right into that corner. And then I'm going to tuck that side of the seam allowance under and then that side over. So on the back, what you can see is a really flat corner. And then with the forefinger of my left hand, I'm going to pinch. So you need to be right in that corner. And then roll that around, and you don't let go of the pinch until the very last minute. And then even though we've got several layers of thickness here, we've got a really nice square corner. Okay, so the trick is your left thumb all the way in, and then you tuck one side under of the seam allowance, the other side over that one, and with your forefinger you pinch that nice flat corner and roll, and you don't let go of the pinch till the very last minute, and then you can kind of squish that little corner out. So give it a shake. So that's the back of your little bag. That's the front with your two little pockets. So the last little step on a tote bag, everything looks better when we give it a press. So first up, I'm going to go around the edges and just roll them so that the seam is sitting exactly in the middle between the two layers. So it helps if you sort of do this with your fingers before you grab the iron. And then we're literally just going to give these edges a nice press, because we want our tote to look all crisp and polished. So handmade, not homemade. And again, this would press up much nicer if I had some steam. So when you do this, guys, make sure you use a bit of steam. So nice crisp edges just to finish up our little tote. You can see I'm just kind of rolling to make sure that seam is exactly in the middle between the two layers. Okay guys, So that is your simple tote with a pocket.